Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome everybody here and also thank you sincerely for your service. I want to talk a little bit about just the actual threat level and the history of it. And so I want to start, first of all, ask each one of you quickly, when do you believe the current, let's call it war on terrorism, really began? And where did this all start? Secretary Beers.
Sir, if we're talking about Al-Qaeda, I believe that we really first experienced it with the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998.
Okay.
We had evidence of them before, for example, in Somalia, during the U.S. intervention in Somalia, but that was where it really came to the fore in terms of my own personal experience.
Director Comey.
I'd trace the current threat back to the 1980s in Afghanistan, a situation I worry about repeating in Syria, where people were getting training and learning and meeting each other, and out of which Osama bin Laden formed the base, Al-Qaeda.
Director Olson.
I mean, I would agree with both my colleagues. I mean, this is a process that's evolved, and we see today the changing threat, as Director Comey described, a metastasized threat. So it's an evolving threat, but it can be traced back to the 1980s.
Okay, so my next question is, I realize the answer is going to have to be very subjective, but based on, that history, that evolution, is the threat level higher today? I'll start with you, Director Olson.
It's a complicated answer. The threat level, as we look at the threat, is more dispersed geographically. The threat has moved out from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region to broad swaths of areas that are largely ungoverned across North Africa and the Middle East. So in some ways, it has become more significant from a geographic perspective and more complicated from an intelligence perspective. I would not say that the threat to the United States of a 9/11 style attack is greater. And in fact, I'd say it is lower today than it was in 2001. So the threat of that type of attack today is lower than it was 12 years ago.
Director Comey.
I'd agree with that. I think because we took the fight to the enemy and got our act together in the last 12 years in very, very important ways, the risk of that spectacular attack in the homeland is significantly lower than it was before 9/11. And what's popped up in its place are these, in the homeland, the risks of the smaller attacks, which are no less obviously concerning to us, smaller and similar overseas. You've got the Hydra head is less able to attack us in the homeland, so it's pushed more overseas and gotten smaller and more disparate in the homeland.
Secretary Beers.
I would concur with that and go back particularly to Matt's comment. The dispersion makes it a bigger challenge in terms of knowing what and where things might happen, but the where is more likely now to be overseas than it is to be in the homeland, which isn't to say that we should drop our guard in any way.
So you really do think that the threat is more severe in terms of a worldwide threat coming onto our shore as opposed to the homegrown terrorists? Was that what you're saying?
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying in terms of the consequences of a particular kind of attack.
It's going to occur overseas as opposed to on the homeland.
The dispersion of the Al-Qaeda brand in North Africa, in Yemen, in Somalia, and in other places, and as it is appearing to manifest in Syria now, means that the kinds of activities that will be undertaken are likely to be undertaken overseas, rather than directed against the homeland. That is not to say that we still don't face a threat, and it's certainly not to say that homegrown violent extremists are inconsequential. Far from it.
I mean, I've always felt that our strongest line of defense against any of these threats really is a strong intelligence gathering capability. To what extent has the NSA disclosures, how extensive has the harm been in terms of those intelligence gathering capabilities? Director Olson.
I would echo the comments recently of Director Clapper, who characterized them as extremely damaging. There's no doubt that those disclosures have made our job harder. We've seen that terrorists, our adversaries, are seeking to learn about the ways that we collect intelligence and seeking to adapt and change the ways that they communicate in order to avoid our surveillance. So it's made our job significantly harder.
How do we repair the damage of it? Director Comey, I mean, what does Congress need to do? What do we need to resist potentially?
Well, I agree with what Matt said about the challenge. Just in 2 months on the job, I've seen changes in terrorist behavior in response to the disclosures about our communications intercept capabilities. I think that Congress just needs to make sure that we don't, if there are changes that need to be made at the margins or an oversight, that we don't make those at the expense of the core capabilities we need as a country.
Secretary Beers, what is your biggest concern that Congress might do that would just be a huge mistake?
I think Director Comey characterized it. What we need to do is make sure that you are comfortable with the oversight, but not to throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of lurching too far, in terms of restrictions on our intelligence, our ability to collect intelligence.
Director Olson, you were talking about going over to Russia for the Olympic Games. Can you describe the common interests we may have with Russia? Can you describe a little bit about who really are some solid world partners in this war on terrorism? Where do we have some common interests?
We have a number of very close partners around the world in our fight against terrorism. Obviously, particularly in Europe and particularly the United Kingdom. In Russia, we face a common threat of violent extremists, and particularly in the North Caucasus area of Russia. So there are a consistent threat stream coming from violent extremists in that area, from terrorists in that area. They're largely focused on Russian government targets, but obviously that's a concern as we approach the Olympics, which will be a very high-profile event in February.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you find Russian cooperation increasing or decreasing over the last, let's say, decade?
I would point to the last several months as a period of increasing cooperation, and Director Comey may be able to speak to this as well, but since the Boston bombing, there has been an increase in cooperation with Russian intelligence authorities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Ayotte, welcome.